Chapter 10 Acquiring Emily. July 9th, 4:17 a.m. at New Hindi Distribution Center train yard basement. Stanley started to awaken, feeling very disoriented. He found himself lying on something flat, hard, and cold. Something rough and grainy was over his face, making the air he was breathing feel stale. He tried to move, only to discover that his wrist and ankles were bound by some sort of straps or restraints. Attempting to move, searing pain reminded him of his previous injuries to his ankle. Stanley called out, quietly at first, then more loudly. Who? Hey! Where? Who's there? Hello? Stanley heard the sound of hard-soled shoes moving across the floor, but still could not see anything. Suddenly, something bumped into the table, causing it to shift and vibrate slightly. Stanley took a startled breath as this happened, followed by the sound of a metallic clunk. Stanley felt his orientation change as the surface he was strapped to went from level to a tilt, putting his feet above his head. With a squeak and a grind, the table came to a halt with Stanley's feet elevated at a 50-degree angle. Stanley called out again, this time sounding more angry than confused. Hey, what in the fuck is going on? Asshole, I'm talking to you! No response came as Stanley now heard the sound of something plastic being set down into something else. He tried to move his head to discover that it was also strapped down to the table. Next, Stanley heard the squeak of a faucet being turned on and the whoosh of running water, followed by the sound of it tumbling into a plastic bucket as the sound echoed inside the bucket and sink. Stanley quickly put together what was happening and what was soon to happen after. Half mortified and half irate, Stanley strained against the restraints, but to no avail, as he grunted and growled through his clenched teeth. A moment later, the sound of the water stopped. Stanley barked out, You're supposed to ask me a question before you start waterboard. Stanley's sentence was cut short by the flow of water going over and through the material on his face, causing him to accidentally inhale some water as it poured down his upside-down nose, followed by the instinctive reflex to inhale while choking. He tried to hold his breath as water went into his nostrils due to his face being upside down. The next 60 seconds felt like an eternity as Stanley struggled for air, taking in some water with each attempted breath. Even after the water was no longer being poured, the material on Stanley's face was still soaked and made breathing without taking in water very difficult. Just as Stanley started to catch a breath, water resumed being poured over him for about another minute. Just as he thought he might pass out, the water stopped again. Coughing up some water, Stanley tried to speak again, only to find himself suddenly impacted in the groin by something hard and pointy. A moment later, the bag was ripped off of Stanley's head, causing his head to move with a little bit of slack in the straps, bouncing his head back into the hard surface of the object to which he was strapped. Stanley suddenly found a bright light shining in his face. Squinting, he could see in the light the silhouette of a figure that seemed both female and familiar. Seemingly from out of nowhere, something hit him hard in the face, followed by the appearance of something square-shaped. With his eyes refocusing, Stanley started to make out in the photograph the image of the woman he had killed, still hanging on a hook before he woke up, strapped to his table made out of a wooden door. He started to connect the dots, that the dead woman in the picture and the silhouette that stood before him seemed to be the same person. Before he could fully process this, Stanley found himself struck in the face again. Stanley blurted out angrily, For fuck's sake, will you— Ah! Suddenly the momentum shifted as the table went right side up again. Just as the table locked into place, a sharp pain went down the side of Stanley's face, followed by the sensation of something warm going down his neck. He suddenly realized that his face had been cut as his eyes were adjusting to the changing light levels. Stanley saw in front of him the exact likeness of the woman he had fought and killed before he ended up here. Stanley muttered, Oh, fuck. The woman in front of him, holding the photograph, suddenly crammed it into Stanley's mouth. The female figure in front of him appeared furious. Oh, fuck is right, she said, changing her scowl to an evil grin. Stanley mumbled out, with the picture still in his mouth. I just, A fist hit Stanley in the side of the head before he could finish the sentence, dazing him some. The woman spoke. "Fuck you and your dog. You killed my sister." Stanley managed to spit out the photo and replied in a taunting tone, "Untie me and I'll make sure you see her again." Stanley found himself closing his eyes as the knife revisited his face, slicing his other cheek the same way. With his mouth closed, he grunted and winced in pain as blood trickled down the other side of his face. Just as he opened his eyes again, he felt a fist strike him in the stomach, knocking the wind out of him. As Stanley gasped, his torturer wrapped her hand around his neck and squeezed, further slowing the flow of air. Looking straight into Stanley's eyes, she tightened her grip for several seconds, completely stopping his breathing. After 30 seconds, she let go, only to punch him in the face again. After a couple of coughs, Stanley shouted out, "You have my daughter!" The torturer chuckled loudly. "Your kind has only dogs." Infuriated, Stanley strained against his bonds, but still to no effect, grunting and mumbling profanities as he twisted and pulled, attempting to free himself. His torturer walked from the swiveling table to the far wall, which had a rack full of all sorts of wicked and cruel-looking instruments of torture. Pausing to look at the shelf, the lady spoke. "I know your kind, my dear. People like you, they're grounded in the world of intellect. To torture your body would have little point. No, 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 no. For you, there must be a torture of the mind." With that said, she went past the jagged and blunted instruments to a small plastic case with a Red Union medical symbol upon it, having a theme similar to a barber's pole, with a red-winged serpent on top, whose body wraps around the pole. She opened the small plastic case and ran her finger along several syringes, each of which had something different printed on its label, written in the Red Union language. Eyeing one of the syringes, she paused, then spoke. "You fear for your daughter's safety. Let us take advantage of that." Grabbing a syringe from the kit, she brought it over to Stanley, holding it with the needle facing upward. Pressing the plunger slightly, a bit of liquid squirted from the tip of the needle. Stanley started to ask, "What are you about to—" Before Stanley could finish the sentence, his torturer plunged the needle into his right shoulder and pressed the plunger all the way down, injecting all of the liquid into his body. She walked away, leaving the needle in his shoulder, cackling to herself as she went, taking great delight in what she felt was proper justice to punish such a wicked man. Walking to the door, she stopped. With her hand over the light switch next to the door, she paused and said, "Nighty-night. Don't have too many nightmares." She next turned off the light, walked through the metal door, then slammed it behind her, leaving Stanley in total darkness. The sound of the door slamming reverberated along the stone walls of the room. As the sound bounced, it increased in volume, intensity, and harshness. The sound seemingly emanated from everywhere simultaneously. Stanley started to realize that whatever had been injected into him was affecting his perceptions. But as the moments went on, he started to lose himself in his thoughts. Each thought turned into a fear, which became a living nightmare, which Stanley would live out in its entirety. He tried not to think about anything, but that just made the thoughts darker and the experiences more pervasive. Stanley not only witnessed and experienced all of his worst fears coming true, he also participated in making them come true. Every stray fear turned into an existential nightmare in which he was forced to participate, doing vile and brutal things to those he loves, over and over and over. Stanley screamed and strained against his restraints as his own fears pushed him to madness with sadness and fury, amplified by the drug coursing through his veins. For what seemed like an eternity, Stanley experienced his most feared nightmares, with himself acting as the antagonist in every situation, violating his own most sacred beliefs and bringing immense suffering to those he loves the most. After several hours that felt to him like forever, Stanley finally lost consciousness. Jacob, Jonas, and Rolf patiently waited all night for their stasis units to be loaded onto their respective trains. Jonas and Rolf, who had been up for nearly 24 hours, used this opportunity to catch up on some much-needed sleep. Jacob, however, was restless, as he was also very claustrophobic. Once past the shipping hub, shipments of Red Union supplies would travel by vacuum tube trains at speeds nearing 600 miles per hour. The stasis unit to reach its intended destination by train was that containing Rolf, the first container. This container was loaded onto a train at 5 a.m. and by 7 a.m. would be uploaded at the nearest processing center. After waiting in silence for a little over an hour after arriving at the processing center, Rolf checked his phone, verifying his coordinates. Still wearing a tattered Red Union uniform up to the waist, he unlocked his stasis unit from within and crept out. Luckily, the unit had been placed on top of several others so that none were stacked on top of it. Rolf found himself in a large, cool room with minimal lighting. Still being cautious, Rolf kept his phone out in silence mode. Reaching into his utility belt attached to the uniform, he retrieved the Matic scanner and attenuated it to the DNA stored within his phone. Slowly and with great attention to detail, he scanned row upon row of stasis containers, looking for DNA matching Emily's. He kept his attention split between the scanner while also listening for potential trouble. Still behind several rows of containers, Rolf used his phone to send a text to Agent Battalion back at Base 7. The text simply read, "Blindfold," which was a signal to engage a program tech support had created to fool the cameras into augmenting a substitutional image on that of himself, replacing any recordings of himself with images of a Red Union member instead. Anyone watching the camera footage would see a Red Union member going about their business. Even with the camera sabotaged, Rolf made sure not to spend more time than needed in any one location, wanting the job to be done quickly. Methodically but thoroughly, Rolf scanned each container, looking for any signs of Emily. At about 8 a.m., Jonas had determined from within his container that it had arrived at its final location by checking his scanning device after waking from a very brief nap on the train. However, Jonas could not act yet, as several voices could be heard in the processing area. He put his ear to the interior wall of the container and attempted to eavesdrop on the conversation. From inside, Jonas could hear two men talking. One was clearly in charge, and the other was a subordinate. Jonas overheard some of the conversation. "The unit appears to be functional, but a thermal scan suggests an inappropriately high temperature." "Open the unit, check the internal temperature, and if the specimen is contaminated, dispose of it using the incinerator." "Yes, sir, I'll get it done," Jonas muttered to himself. "Shit." Jonas fished into his pockets, retrieving a thin, strong metallic cord. He crossed his hands over, concealing the wire underneath them as he prepared to have his stasis unit checked, compromising his position. The Red Union soldier talked to himself in a low voice as he visually checked the containers, looking for a particular number. 10098, 10099. Jonas was in container number 10101, on top of the next adjacent stack of containers. Jonas remained completely still and quiet, anticipating having to improvise once the Red Union soldier arrived at his compromised stasis container. Jonas overheard the Red Union soldier mumbling to himself, "Ah, man, it's on top of the whole stack." Urgh. The Red Union soldier walked out, over to a corner of the large room to retrieve a battery-powered two-wheeled hand truck with a built-in forklift. Disconnecting it from a charger, he powered it up and wheeled it over to the stack of stasis units which Jonas' unit rested on top of. Jonas overheard the whirring sound of the forklift unit as the soldier raised it to the level of the stasis unit, about 5 feet off the ground. There was a sound of two metal rods scraping the side of the plastic container as the soldier moved the lifting arms into position. After a scrape and a thud, the box jostled and started to move up, away from its stack, and then down to the floor. The container came to a rest as the bottom made contact with the concrete floor below. Jonas kept his eyes closed, but could feel the presence of the Red Union soldier peering into the container. Jonas had exceptional hearing and could recognize most sounds he heard with his eyes closed. Knowing he was being inspected, Jonas did his best to play dead inside the container. Next, he heard the sound of the latches being loosened from the outside. Jonas kept his body loose and motionless, taking only the most shallow and slow breaths. A moment later, the container opened. Jonas kept still as the soldier scanned the interior of the box and then ran the scanner up and down his body. After taking the scans, the soldier muttered to himself, Failed unit, just like at that other location. Well, that's what we get for such cheap labor. Wait, why is the body temperature higher than... The Red Union soldier set down the scanner and, turning slightly, reached into his lab coat pocket to get his e-pad onto which he would record his findings, to be turned into command for analysis. Sensing that the soldier may be distracted, Jonas opened one eye the slightest bit to verify. Seeing that the soldier's attention was on the device and not on him, Jonas took the opportunity to strike. Making not a sound, he sat up, holding the length of the wire between both hands. Standing slowly with the soldier's back turned to him, Jonas slipped the metallic wire swiftly over the soldier's head and around his neck. As soon as the cord was in place, Jonas pulled back and up with all his strength. The soldier made no sound aside from his boots scuffling across the floor as the garrote tightened around his neck. The soldier struggled in vain as Jonas kept his grip mercilessly tight. The soldier strained at the cord, unable to move it, tried to move in several directions, and tried to wiggle free, all to no avail as the life was slowly snuffed out of him by the suffocating garrote. After a few tense moments, the soldier's body leaned downward limply toward the floor as Jonas let out some of the slack in the line to set the body down to rest. Thinking quickly as he heard a voice off in the distance, Jonas quickly removed the soldier's jacket and shirt and set him into the container. Moving swiftly and quietly, he closed the lid with the soldier inside, took the pad, finished typing the word defective in the Red Union language, then set the equipment on top of the clear window in the lid. Jonas then put on the soldier's shirt and jacket, being careful to keep his back to anyone who might approach. The commander from earlier came stomping back in, calling out in his native language, "Well, what's the issue?" Jonas, standing with his back to the container, thought quickly and answered as best as he could in the proper language, doing his best to mimic the fallen soldier's voice. Defective unit. We'll dispose of it properly." The commander barked out, "Once you're done with that, join the engineering team and returns to process garbage." Jonas sounded off, "Yes, sir." Jonas kept his back turned as the commander spoke with someone else, then got called off to another location to deal with another issue. Breathing a sigh of relief as the room became empty again, Jonas got down to the business of scanning each container. He went from one to the next in numerical order, starting with the lowest number and working his way up. It took nearly an hour to scan every container, but Jonas found no sign of Emily either. Jacob was restless, but keeping his breathing calm as his stasis unit was unloaded off a train at around 9 a.m. He waited patiently as the container was unloaded from the train, loaded onto a trailer, then transported into a large building. Finally, after nearly another hour, his stasis unit was loaded into a large room with minimal lighting. The stasis unit was at the bottom of a stack of 6. Several minutes later, the room was quiet, and Jacob was anxious to get out of such a close quarters confines. Unlatching the mechanisms from within, Jacob found the lid impossible to lift, as over 1,000 pounds rested on top of the stasis unit. Seeing no other way out, and in near total darkness, Jacob fished around in his go-bag until he found the torch he had used to cut iron gates. Rolling over onto his stomach in tight quarters, he activated the torch and started to cut out a segment of the container at its head. The plastic was easy to cut through, but made thick black smoke as it burned, forcing him to hold his breath as he cut out a square-shaped hole through which he would hope to slip unnoticed. With the hole cut, Jacob shimmied his way out, trying to tuck in his broad shoulders to fit through the opening. Jacob managed to wiggle his way out and onto the cement floor, but he had to bend at the waist as there was only a couple of feet of room between the container and the rear wall of the room. Once he had freed himself fully, Jacob first made sure no one had detected him, then stretched out, taking in a slow, deep breath through his nose, then exhaling slowly through his mouth. Staying behind the rows and rows of containers, Jacob readied his scanning device and picked the bottom row on the left end to start. Exasperated from having been cooped up in a box for so long, Jacob kept his focus on making sure to scan each container, starting from the left, moving to the right, and then up. Scanning through stacks of plastic coffins with human bodies frozen within gave Jacob a chilling shudder as he thought about the nature of the room he was in. Jacob knew full well that Matic technology was capable of reviving a body from a frozen state. But bodies, especially young ones, under these horrid circumstances, are likely to be harvested quickly upon arrival, if not initially before even being shipped, as certain organ types and young donors were in high demand. Jacob felt as though he were racing against time as he scanned each container, one at a time, with hundreds left to scan. Stanley was drifting in and out of consciousness, still under the remnants of the effects of the hallucinogenic substance coursing through his veins. Strange and terrible nightmares appeared into and faded out of his consciousness just as fast as any fleeting thought. Through the mud in his mind, Stanley could faintly hear his phone making noise off in the distance. The sound quickly morphed into a nightmare, though by now the levels of the drug in his system were low enough that some semblance of reality could be perceived. Stanley recognized the tone as being his Matic phone receiving a text. Stanley's mind kept him occupied with the thought that his daughter had been found, but with no body parts left, as she had been completely stripped of all organs. In terror and half-conscious, he strained against his binds to no avail. A few moments later, Stanley lost consciousness again. Some time later, somewhere in the haze within his mind, Stanley could hear the phone sounding off again. The room was still dark, save for the minimal light coming from the gap under the door to the room. He could almost determine the direction of the sound, but was confused as to what the sound was or why he was hearing it. The sound morphed into a terrible dream as he lost consciousness again. He re-experienced his deepest fears anew, each time rousing, then losing consciousness. In every case, Stanley became the antagonist of his own imagination. With every scenario, he continued to hurt and destroy all he loves and cherishes. In the midst of dark dreams, Stanley heard a sound once again. He believed himself to have recognized it at his Matic phone, but this time he didn't lose the thought. Focusing in on the blurping sound, Stanley now realized that it was the third such occurrence. Stanley remembered three. 3 phones. 3 messages. 3 men. Where is Emily? Phones. The message. Emily! Still halfway in a dream, Stanley felt something prick his right hand. Looking down through blurry eyes, Stanley realized that down was up. He also pieced together that a jagged splinter from the surface of the door had pricked him in the right hand. His foggy mind pieced together rough surface, leather strap. Stanley had been sweating profusely while dreaming, and the leather strap around his hand was saturated with sweat. Rediscovering his will to escape, Stanley started to rub the strap against the splintered wood as roughly as he could, pulling the strap taut with his wrist. Bits of the leather strap started to give way as Stanley relentlessly sawed at it against the rough wood. A few minutes later, the leather strap snapped. Stanley chuckled to himself, almost elated, but kept his focus on freeing himself. Still lying on the table, head facing downward, Stanley reached his right hand with the broken finger over to the left hand, which was still bound. Doing his best to block out the pain, he used his right hand to free up his left hand, using the buckles on the underside of the door. Fighting back tears of pain and biting his own lower lip, Stanley managed to use his broken right hand to free his left. With both hands now free, he could turn his attention to the straps around his ankles. Before Stanley could address the straps around his feet, he heard the sound of footsteps coming toward the dark room he was in. Glancing over, he saw the shadow of 2 feet stopping in front of the door. Next, he heard the sound of jingling keys and the lock being turned inside the metallic door. Thinking quickly, Stanley decided to fake being still strapped and barely conscious. A moment later, the metallic door to the room fell open with a clunk, allowing a stream of outside light into the dark room, which seemed to reveal itself to be a portion of some filthy concrete basement. The floor was stained with blood and other excretions, and the walls seemed to be coated in both dust and mold. Stanley closed his eyes and tried to feign unconsciousness as someone came through the door. Stanley managed to keep his body loose and limp and kept himself quiet despite pressure on his dislocated ankle as he hung from his feet. He heard the same hard-soled, high-heeled shoes as before. The door slammed shut, and the torturer moved to within a few feet of him as he remained motionless. She muttered. You look entirely too peaceful. I think you need more medicine. Hearing this, Stanley pretended to mumble, Oh, please, no more. The torturer cackled to herself. Oh, but you deserve it. And this time I think you need a higher dose. She walked over to the same cabinet and prepared another syringe, this time with twice as high a dose in it. Stanley sneaked a peek as she prepared the syringe, smiling to herself with delight at the thought of more mental torture. Stanley kept his eyes closed as the torturer walked back over to him. Passing in front of Stanley, the torturer giggled, saying, Really is a shame, and I can only give you this dose once, since your heart's going to explode. With one eye only open a crack, Stanley took action. As his torturer drew close with the syringe, Stanley opened his eyes and grabbed the torturer's wrist with both hands, quickly turning the syringe in her direction and pushing it into her lower stomach before she could even react. In shock that the needle was now inside her, she reached with the other hand to remove it, but by then, Stanley had punched the top of the plunger, pushing the liquid rapidly into her body. She screamed, stepping almost stumbling backwards, realizing that the drug was already inside her. She pulled the needle out and dropped it to the floor in a panic, trying to think of what to do. While she searched her stock, slowly succumbing to the effects of the drug, Stanley went to work freeing his ankles from the leather restraints. Stanley pulled with all his might, loosening the straps, then falling onto the back of his shoulders. The torturer, now panic-stricken and starting to hallucinate, reached for a rusty serrated knife on the table next to the medical supplies. Seeing this, Stanley quickly rose to his feet, despite the dislocated ankle. With clenched teeth, Stanley stood his ground as the panic-stricken woman charged at him with a knife held up high in an overhand posture. She charged at him with the knife, intending to stab him. When she came down with the knife, Stanley redirected her momentum, turning the knife around, causing her to fall onto the knife, plunging it deep into her chest, between two ribs, puncturing a lung. She shrieked at first, but quickly started to choke on her own blood. She looked on in horror while the knife handle protruding from her chest as Stanley drew back his right fist and struck her squarely in the throat. She fell to the ground, holding on to the knife handle with one hand and with her other hand on her throat, choking to death on her own blood while under the effects of the terror-generating chemicals in her body, amping up the terror of the experience of dying by suffocation. Slightly winded and huffing, Stanley stood over her and spit in her face as the life left her eyes. Stanley, still suffering some effects from the hallucinogen, seeing and hearing terrible things over reality, quickly hobbled over to the door and locked it from the inside using the deadbolt. He limped over to a support beam, placing his foot against it, then applied pressure, using his body weight to put the dislocated ankle back into place. The stabbing pain helped him to root himself within reality again. Letting out a stifled grunt with his left hand over his mouth, he eased into moving around again, while looking around to get acquainted with his immediate surroundings. Remembering the direction he had heard the phone sounds coming from, he limped his way across the floor to the series of cabinets where medical supplies and torture instruments were stored. In a metal locker, Stanley found the bag of equipment he had arrived with, including the scanner and phone. Picking up the phone, he quickly moved to see what messages it had received. Jonas and Rolf had sent messages saying, negative. However, Jacob had sent a message saying, I found her, need extraction. The message had been sent nearly 20 minutes ago. Stanley knew he had to hurry. Retrieving his gear and looking down at the torturer, Stanley realized that her uniform might fit him, if not a bit snug. It was also stained with blood from the stab wound. Looking around, Stanley eyed a red Union jacket hanging on the far wall. A bit oversized, but it would do to cover up the blood stain. Stanley moved the uniform, put it on, and topped off the look with the jacket. Looking about quickly, Stanley also noticed a very concealing gas mask hanging on the far wall. Perfect, he whispered to himself, putting on the mask. Stanley was now disguised from head to toe, but would need to get back to the storeroom from which he had entered the building. He saw a computer terminal near the medical supplies and thought perhaps he could use that to decipher where he was. Making his way to the computer, he sat down in the nearby leather chair and wheeled himself over to it. The computer was locked in a screen requiring a password. Still holding the Matic phone, he pulled at the USB wire from the computer and connected it to his phone. Pulling up an app on the phone, the digits of the password started to show up, one by one. As the series of digits appeared on the phone, Stanley typed them into the computer. After a series of letters and numbers were keyed in, the computer was unlocked. From there, Stanley navigated several windows and managed to disable the room's security camera. He then pulled up a map of the building he was in, pinpointed his location, and plotted a course back to the storeroom through which he had gained entry. Looking over the route, he quickly memorized it, then set the computer back to its previous state. Just as Stanley was making his way to the door to leave, there was an attempt to open it, then a hard series of knocks, followed by someone shouting, "Security! Open this door!" Thinking quickly, Stanley eyed a bottle of window cleaner. He retrieved a syringe from the medical supplies and plunged it into the bottle of blue liquid. He quickly hid the needle behind his back, went to the door, unlocked it, and opened it under the force of the security officer behind. Before the security officer could even speak, Stanley shouted, "The prisoner has escaped!" The security officer barked out, "This room's camera has been disabled. Why was this door locked?" Stanley replied enthusiastically, "The prisoner has escaped. I was trying to secure the area, and someone was messing with the computer." The security officer stomped over the computer to take a look, turning his back to Stanley. Stanley used this opportunity to jab the syringe straight into the officer's neck from behind, injecting the liquid directly into his carotid artery. The officer reacted at first by grabbing his neck while grunting. He quickly started to gasp and within a few seconds fell over dead. Stanley looked about quickly to make sure no one had seen. No one seemed to be around, so Stanley dropped the needle, retrieved his pistol from his bag, chambered a round, put it into his jacket pocket, went out the door, and closed it behind him. Stanley did his best to not display discomfort in his gait as he walked on his injured ankle. Underneath the mask, he was chewing on his own upper lip. He knew that cameras were mounted all throughout the compound, and he did not want to attract undue attention. He managed to make his way down the hall to a set of stairs which he could climb to the first floor he had entered from. Each step was awkward as he used the good leg to climb each step, resting some pressure on the back leg with each launch of the good leg, causing almost as much agony as stepping onto the bad ankle. Finally, up the 2 flights of stairs, he went through the right door opposite the other. Making his way down the hallway, Stanley had only 100 feet or so to travel. A left turn, one more hall, and then a few doors down was the storage room he had entered through. Bearing the pain well, Stanley made his way past a few Red Union soldiers and employees without drawing any attention. Still suffering effects of the hallucinogen, Stanley kept his focus on his goal and his pain, pushing through the experience with his eyes set on escape. He allowed nothing to impede his progress. When he got to the door to the dry storage room, he found it to be already open. Stepping inside, he pressed the button to close the door behind him, locking it from being accessible from the outside. Once inside, Stanley discovered 2 Red Union employees near the hole that he and his party had carved out and passed through. He moved to their location to greet them. One of the 2 men barked out, "Well, did you bring the welder?" Thinking quickly, Stanley pointed to a higher spot in the pipe and asked, "How are we going to reach that crack up there?" The man and the woman looked up where Stanley had pointed. As they did, Stanley reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the pistol. With a round already chambered, he shot them both in the back of the head before either could respond to what was happening. Knowing that someone must have heard the shots, Stanley scrambled to put his dive gear on as quickly as he could. Already hearing banging at the door, Stanley put on just the tank, the mask, and the flippers, foregoing the rest of the gear. Securing his go bag, he went to the pipe and jumped directly down into the water about 30 feet below. It hurt his feet some, but keeping his knees bent kept the impact from being too harsh. Keeping much of his momentum, he turned around underwater and swam deep into the pipe. The ocean water in the pipe was a bit cold, but once Stanley got down to where the pipe emptied into the ocean, the water became very cold. The pain in his ankle and the uncomfortably cold water kept Stanley focused. He made his way to the last known location of the Mark 337 as swiftly as he could. Swimming furiously, Stanley suddenly felt a sharp pain in his good leg. He next noticed his progress impeded. Turning around, he discovered that a shark had bit him on the leg and was holding on. Blood spilled into the water as Stanley struggled to free himself from the jaws of the shark. Seeing as how that wasn't working, he pulled the pistol from his jacket again and fired it at the shark, but the water slowed the velocity of the bullets too much for them to be very effective. Having fired all the bullets, Stanley dropped the pistol and instead reached for the combat knife in his bag. Bending at the waist with an underwater sit-up, he stabbed at the side of the shark's head several times, filling the water around him with blood. After 4 stabs, the shark finally let go. Stanley somehow managed to swim the rest of the distance to the portal of the Mach 337. Emerging from the portal and feeling quite lightheaded, Stanley made his way directly to the vessel's computer systems. Engaging the space-folding transporter system, he locked onto the coordinates of the 3 Matic phones and transported aboard any persons within 5 feet of each focal point, using 3 separate beams as intended. The process completed, bringing 4 people aboard, just as Stanley was passing into unconsciousness from blood loss and fatigue. Finishing the transport and getting only a glimpse of his daughter's silhouette, Stanley passed out and collapsed to the floor.